The Civil War was unique. If we look back at the Revolutionary War, very few soldiers were literate. If you spring ahead after the Civil War, you begin to get censorship in the mail. And if you come up to the current moment, you've got emails and Twitter and Facebook, which are ephemeral and which we may not be able to capture, and we won't ever have what we had from the Civil War.
This program is a video presentation of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Please consider making a monetary gift to support our efforts to bring Civil War history to viewers like you. Visit CWRTDC.org to learn how.
Welcome, everyone. I am Kurt DeSoto, President of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. We have a very full and very interesting program ahead of us. I have the privilege tonight to introduce to our group Candice Hooper, who will talk about her upcoming book, Delivered Under Fire, Absalom Markland and Freedom's Mail. The book is available now from the sites she is listed on her website at CandiceHooper.com. Ms. Hooper was born on Guam to a U.S. Navy hospital corpsman and his intrepid Hoosier wife, and like many military children, moved from place to place and from school to school. The one constant in her life was the libraries from Saipan to Norfolk, Virginia, which her parents made the family's first stop after every household move, and which has paid dividends, many dividends, not only for her, but also for her readers and her listeners, which we will see today. Ms. Hooper received her undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of Illinois and a law degree from Georgetown University. After a career on Capitol Hill as aide to the late Congressman Charlie Wilson of Wilson's war fame, and as a lobbyist with her husband, Ms. Hooper discovered her true intellectual passion, history. She returned to school and earned an MA in history with a concentration in military history from George Washington University. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Journal of Military History, and the Michigan War Studies Review. She has also lectured at the U.S. Naval Academy and at George Washington University. Her previous book, Lincoln's Generals' Wives, 4 Women Who Influenced the Civil War for Better and for Worse, won 3 national awards. So please join me in welcoming Candice Hooper.
Thank you very much, Kurt. I'm going to do a brief overview of the book, Delivered Under Fire, talking just a little bit about where I got the idea for it, how I researched a man who has been lost to history, and what I learned about it and about the U.S. Postal Service history. So that's the cover of the book, Delivered Under Fire, Absalom Markland and Freedom's Mail. And I do love this cover. The other authors know you're often just really at the mercy of your publisher for the cover, but I think they've done a beautiful job. They've got a stamp that is both time appropriate and a cancellation that is era appropriate too for the book. So how did I get the idea for the book? Well, when I spoke to you all in 2018, I said my next book was going to be about the U.S. Navy, because my first book, Lincoln's Generals' Wives, really sort of reflected my mom in that she was a military wife. And I knew that military wives had great impact on their husbands' careers. And so that's why I dug deep into history to look at the wives of Fremont, McClellan, Sherman, and Grant to see how they impacted their husbands' careers. But the more I looked at that, the more I kept remembering about this man and this name that had come up while I researched this book. He was sort of like an earworm, and his name was Absalom Markland. And so in this first book, I wrote this and the part about Julia Grant and Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant needed Julia in a way that none of the other generals needed their wives. He craved constant reassurance of her love, her steadfast confidence in him, and the cheer she always brought to his days. Julia was a faithful lover, but she was a faithless correspondent. Grant's letters to her from 1844 to 1862 brim with painful pleas for her to write to him. They are often truly heartbreaking to read, and I mean that sincerely. I would curl up in a fetal position on the sofa sometimes after reading them. But Julia rarely wrote to him, and her behavior appears thoughtless, at times even callous. The vast evidence of her undying love for Grant, however, belies those adjectives. There is no complete answer to why she neglected to write him, although a physical defect in one of her eyes played an important role. So during the Civil War, she decided to be with him as much as she could, often bringing her children and her slave. And I document that over the course of the Civil War, she traveled more than 10,000 miles to be with Ulysses. In February 1862, she was in Cairo, Illinois, as Grant left aboard U.S. steamer New Uncle Sam, heading to Fort Henry in rebel-held Tennessee. With the 39-year-old Grant, on board the steamer was Absalom Markland, a special agent of the U.S. Post Office Department. Markland, who had been Grant's childhood schoolmate, had recently been detailed to Cairo to investigate problems with the U.S. mail service in that important military hub. On the eve of the steamer's departure, Markland remembered that Grant, quote, asked me if I did not want to see a fight and invited me to go to Fort Henry with him. Markland eagerly accepted. Although their paths had crossed earlier during Markland's stay in Cairo, it was not until Grant began the trip away from Julia that the general, quote, inquired if it were not possible to keep the mail up to the army and to take the soldier's letter home, wrote Markland in an account penned more than 20 years later. On my answering that I thought this could be done, recalled Markland, he gave me that branch of service, and from that beginning sprang the great Army mail service of the war, and to General Grant, the credit of originating that service belongs. So as I had been researching that book, I had come across this man, Absalom Markland. His name popped up here and there. And it turned out that there was a file of his papers at the Library of Congress, where I spent many, many days researching the previous book, because it was mostly based on letters between the husbands and wives of these generals. As I thought about this, I began to realize just how important letters have been to the more than 70,000 books about the Civil War that have been published since the war. That's literally like 1.5 books every day since the Civil War started. There's been a book about the Civil War published, and so many of them rely on letters. You all know it. So many of those books actually are just collections of letters, which are always fascinating. That was a unique moment in our history. The Civil War was unique. If we look back at the Revolutionary War, it was really before the United States Post Office Department started, although Benjamin Franklin had worked up a colonial post office. But very few soldiers were literate, and the Postal Service wasn't that great. So you have fewer letters to draw on for the Revolutionary War. If you spring ahead after the Civil War, you begin to get censorship in the mail. And if you come up to the current moment, you've got emails and Twitter and all sorts of Facebook. which are ephemeral and which we may not be able to capture, and we won't ever have what we had from the Civil War, these tangible written letters written by the millions, largely, almost completely uncensored, and that were saved by their families. And I thought about the debt that we owe to the people who saved the letters, to the people who archived the letters, and to the people who delivered the letters. So I started this research in the Library of Congress, looking at Absalom Markland's file. And here was an example of the many letters there were 130 documents in his file. There was nothing personal. These were all work documents. But look at this one. Vicksburg, July 6th, 1863. And he's telling the quartermaster is telling, the chief quartermaster is telling a quartermaster, furnish a team for the postmaster until one can be supplied by the post office department. And I thought, so he's in Vicksburg, literally, 2 days after it's captured, after the 4th of July. And as I looked at so many of the others, from nearly every single battle that Grant was in, and you just look on this map and you see there's Fort Donelson, there's Nashville, there's Chattanooga, there's Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing, there's Memphis, Arkansas Point, Chickasaw Bayou. And I thought, this guy was sort of everywhere. But in order to write a book, you need more than just the work documents from somebody. That doesn't give you a lot. So I began to look online, found thousands of newspaper articles. That was amazing. Everywhere he went, newspapers in the North and the South told where he was and where he was going next. But again, there was still nothing personal about that. But then I found, and this is what I went to see in person when I visited Nashville and Franklin, the Tennessee State Library and Archive. They have a file of letters from Absalom Markland. And if you look at this one, Fort Donelson, Tennessee, February 18th, 1862. So he was there. I am in excellent health. He's saying he was at the battle. He was there at the battle. And indeed he was. He was. Literally an hour after the fort was taken, he was there delivering mail to the troops. That was my aha moment. These letters in Tennessee, Tennessee State Archives, there were more than 30 letters to his wife during the war, before and during the war, and to his brother-in-law, who was his best friend, and to other figures that gave the person behind the story. And I thought, okay, now I can write this book. So I spread my net further out, looking at all of the different places he had been, looking for archives there, doing most of this online because COVID had begun. And in one of those places, it actually was an auction house. They had this set of 2 photos of Absalom Markland and his wife, Martha. This is the only photograph of Martha that I have been able to find. This is one of 3 photographs of Absalom Markland. This was probably in about 1852 when they were married. But there you see, finally, I got to see what he looked like. There were other things I wanted to do. I wanted to do a genealogy on him, but COVID had shut down all of the big genealogy archives by then. I did go into the National Archives online and found some amazing stuff. And then finally, in April of 2021, the Museum and Archives in Maysville, Kentucky reopened. And I jumped in my car from here in Florida and drove up there. Maysville, Kentucky is where he was from, is where he went to school with Grant at the Maysville Academy, and is where, toward the end of his life, he wrote down all of these amazing reminiscences about life in that incredibly important town in Kentucky in his youth. So what did I learn from all of this research? What I learned was that Absalom Markland occupies a unique place in history. At the beginning of the Civil War, at the request of his childhood friend Ulysses Grant, he created the most efficient military mail system, parts of which still survive today. Throughout the war, he was almost always the first civilian representative of the U.S. government to enter major southern cities when the U.S. Army reclaimed them from the Confederacy, bringing priceless mail bags of morale to the troops. He followed Grant and his armies from Fort Henry in 1862 to City Point in 1865. And at Grant's request, he even arrived ahead of Sherman and his army in Savannah at the end of their historic march in December of 1864 with 20 tons of mail for the troops. Markland also met regularly with President Lincoln during the war, and he carried important messages between Lincoln and Generals Grant and Sherman at crucial points in the nation's peril. And after the Civil War, when the Ku Klux Klan waged its savage reign of terror and intimidation, Markland's decisive action proved to be the tipping point in securing the executive powers President Grant needed to combat the Klan. Some of the things that struck me in reading about, in learning about Absalom Markland and in writing about him was how close he was to Grant. He knew Grant before he was Ulysses S. Grant. He knew him when he was Hiram Ulysses Grant. And at the Maysville Academy, they called him Lys. And he was in a debating society with Lys. And he tells stories about him there. But he went on to him, as we said, from Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Grant called him Colonel, and so he was called Colonel by other people. But one of the things that was really amazing is that Markland is one of the few people to have been given as a gift a tangible remembrance of Grant's friendship with him. And that was the saddle that Grant used basically from the Fort Henry through Appomattox Courthouse. This is a stereoscope, of course, of the saddle. And you'll see, I don't know if you can see me pointing, but the saddle, it's sitting on the back of a chair, and looks like a paper there. Well, that's a letter that Grant wrote to him. And the amazing thing about this is that Grant gave him that saddle on May 19th, 1865, less than a month after the end of the Civil War. While Grant is now, he's finally dealt with helping to find John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of his commander-in-chief. He's now downsizing all of the troops, the huge army, at the same time that he's commanding the military governors of all of the Confederate states in Reconstruction. And on May 19th, he sends Markland this letter. Colonel, I take great pleasure in presenting you the Grimsley saddle, which I have used in all the battles from Fort Henry, Tennessee in February 1862 to the battles about Petersburg, Virginia, ending in the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on the 9th of April, 1865. I present this saddle to you not for any intrinsic value it possesses, but as a mark of friendship and esteem After continued service with you through the Great Rebellion, our services commencing together at Cairo, Illinois in the fall of 1861 and continuing to the present day. I hope our friendship, if not our continued services together, will continue as heretofore. Yours truly, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. When I called the U.S. Grant Library in Starkville, Mississippi, and asked, did Grant have really a sort of a history of giving gifts to people, like the saddle he gave to Markland? The response I got was, what saddle? No, he really didn't give gifts. There's almost no record of him giving gifts outside his own family. And so this is really such a tangible expression of Grant's esteem and friendship for Markland. This is what it looked like in, I think this is in the 1900s when it was being displayed at the Dayton Soldiers' Home. And this is what it looks like today. This picture was taken by the curator at the Quartermaster's Museum in Fort Lee, Virginia. They have the saddle there on display, but they really know very little about Markland. So I'm going to be delighted to send them a copy of my book. They took such beautiful pictures and it's in such beautiful shape. So this was one of the things that I thought was just amazing about Markland. Here's somebody that I'd never heard of, despite all of the books I'd read. And here he had gotten this incredible gift. One of the other things that I learned, a lot that I learned, because this was my first foray into the postal world and the world of stamps and the world of mail, which is such a generous and interesting world, but were the differences between the mail in the North and the South during the Civil War. And I'll be happy to answer any questions after the talk, but suffice it to say, on May 31st of 1861, Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, stopped delivery of mail to the South and stopped delivering mail from the South. John Regan, who had been a congressman from Texas and finally took Jefferson Davis's entreaties to become the Confederate postmaster, had basically stolen all of the postal supplies from Southern post offices, and he set up his own. So we had two separate postal services operating, and they operated very differently, largely because the South had very, very poor rail transportation. And so by most experts' opinions, most of the mail from the home front to the front lines in the Confederate Army was not even transported by the Confederate mail system. It was done informally by soldiers on furlough, going on furlough, coming back from furlough, and also by what were called Confederate mail runners. And in one of the most amazing coincidences of the Civil War, of which we all know there were amazing coincidences, the most famous Confederate mail runner was also from Kentucky, had also worked on steamboats like Absalom Markland, was also named Absalom Grimes. And I write a little bit about him and I tell about the Southerners. So it was two very different postal services. And I knew that just because of what I had read earlier. What I didn't know also that I learned even more about was that there were two different postal conventions between the Army in the East, which was under McClellan's jurisdiction and later under a series of other commanders' jurisdiction, and the Army in the West, which used the system that Grant asked Markland to set up. Grant's was so much more efficient that when he came west, became Lieutenant General, when he came east, the famous Grant comes east, Lieutenant General, he brings Markland with him. And the whole Army of the Potomac is so cheered that they are now going to actually get mail on a reliable basis and be able to send mail home on a reliable basis. It's a fascinating story. But the flood of mail unleashed by the Civil War also created other changes in our society. And I won't go into detail on them now, but I loved learning about them and writing about them. Until the Civil War, you had to go to the post office and wait in line to get your mail. Sometimes they had separate lines for women and for men, but most of the time it was just you waited in line to get your mail. And the postmaster in Cleveland became distraught by so many women breaking down in tears when they would get either a bundle of unopened mail, which obviously signified that their husband, father, son was dead, or they would get letters from their husband, son, father's commanding officers telling them they were dead. And so that postmaster, his name was James Briggs, decided he should start delivering mail to homes. And that was the first home delivery of mail was during the Civil War, began in Cleveland, stretched to 50 different cities. And what did that do? In order to deliver mail, you had to know what the street name was. Some streets didn't even have names. You had to have street signs. And then you had to know which house it was. And so that was the first time that houses were numbered. And so also laws were enacted to clear sidewalks so that the postman could get through. And a number of other changes were made that were the direct result of the huge numbers of letters that went back and forth between the front lines and the home front during the Civil War in the North. But the other thing that was really important when Grant became president, as I mentioned earlier, was right at the time that the Ku Klux Klan rose. Well, it began rising in Tennessee in 1865. And there were so many efforts to try to enable the federal government to crack down on the Ku Klux Klan when the states weren't cracking down. And this became a real problem in 1871, and Grant wanted another law that specifically enabled him to handle difficult situations when the states wouldn't handle them. And so in 1871, he appointed Markland to be in charge of the Postal Service in Kentucky and Tennessee. And in doing so, his Postmaster General, John Andrew Jackson Creswell, was one of the most fierce abolitionists before the war, and with Grant's blessing, took it upon himself to integrate the post office department to a degree that made it the most integrated department of the government. In 1871, fully knowing what was going to happen, Markland hired William H. Gibson Sr., who had lived in Tennessee for many years and also knew what was going to happen. And he hired him as the first Black railroad mail agent in the state of Kentucky. And the first day he was on the job, he was the crowds were dumbstruck. And the second day on the job, the Ku Klux Klan came and attacked him. He was beaten, but he got inside the railroad car and sped on his way. But from that point on, for the next month, Markland had a squad of 10 U.S. soldiers protect him. And this drove the Kentucky and the Southern legislators crazy, not only protecting him, but just the notion that there was a Black railroad mail agent in Kentucky incensed them. Finally, Grant decided that he had had enough. We weren't going to do this. A Black man should be able to be a rail agent in Kentucky as well as he was in New York. And he and Markland decided they would remove the soldiers from the route, but they would also just stop the mail from the route. And so when the mail was stopped between Lexington and Louisville, which included the capital of Kentucky, Frankfort, that drove the Southern legislators into just a tizzy. All along, Black men and women and children had been killed and their homes burned in South Carolina. That didn't make any change in the law. The government complained it couldn't collect taxes because the Ku Klux Klan stopped that. That didn't make any change in the law. But when they stopped the mail, that turned the tide. And that was the tipping point for the passage of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which Grant wanted and which he signed literally hot off the press as soon as it was passed in Congress. He was at the Capitol and signed it in the president's room. There are so many stories that I came across that Markland told about Grant and Sherman, because he was with them so often, that have never been published before, that I never heard before. There's just so much in this book that I'd love to tell you about, but I'm going to leave time for questions. So I'm going to close with just a little bit about him. And this is a photograph of him in 1862 that I found through the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Although no record of even an honorary U.S. Army commission exists, and you see here Colonel A.H. Markland, General Grant called Markland Colonel, and because he did, the Army and most civilians did too for the rest of his life. For decades, Colonel Markland made national news wherever he went. Hundreds of newspapers throughout the continental United States reported his movements and his actions during and after the war, and hundreds also reported his death in 1888. And yet, Markland is all but invisible now, even as books about the Civil War and Reconstruction proliferate. Many biographies of Lincoln, Sherman, and Grant include a footnote about Markland, but his important, sometimes daily interaction with them during and especially after the war has so far escaped notice. One place, however, positions Markland front and center. The Smithsonian Institution's National Postal Museum, which you should all visit, has a portion of a letter from General Oliver Otis Howard to Markland just after the war, at the entrance and at the exit to its exhibit on the Civil War mail. It is a tribute to the importance of military mail and recognizes the value of news from home in every war ever fought. And here's just an excerpt. You well know how anxiously the officers and soldiers of the Army watch and wait for letters from home, and the receipt of them is the greatest pleasure they enjoy. And when a long period has elapsed and there is no mail, no news from home, a feeling of despondency and gloom seems to settle on all. And so I would close by saying that Absalom Hanks Markland carried more than letters in the mail he delivered under fire, as a number of his colleagues attested. He carried soldiers' hopes and the nation's future. Thank you so much.
Candice, that was simply amazing. That was amazing. I saw you choking up there.
Well, I just have loved doing this book.
Yes, and
Telling the story.
Anybody who's been in the military as a child or as a wife or a spouse, they understand how important those letters are. I married into a military family, and I didn't even know that until there was one time here a colleague at work said that he had received from the nuns where his father was in an assisted living place after he passed away. The nuns had kept in a tide box some audio recording sent home. He didn't get the ones from his wife to him, but all of the letters. But to see those letters and digitize those, I saw how critical it was for spouses and family to get those letters. It's so emotional, the morale that you were talking about. But even more important than that, actually, it was the physical connection, because you had your dad or your wife away from you, and you were getting a letter that he or she actually wrote and touched, and that was the closest you could get to them. So it was amazing to see that. I don't know if you include those types of exchanges in your book, but I do.
do.
So,
I do.
well, thank you very much for bringing, yet again, not just the general's wives as you did in your last book, but something that is not really talked about much and is so meaningful. And then, of course, with Colonel Markland, I guess he probably was not a self-promoter. And so after the war, unlike other folks that wrote their own biographies or went on speaking tours, he did his duty, and he was not a self-promoter, and that's why there aren't any writings about him until now. So thank you very much. That's wonderful. Let's see, we do have some questions. I guess that one question would be, what did he do actually after his life? I don't know if you got after being in the war.
Yes, I tried to make this as complete a biography because I think I'm probably going to be the only person who writes his biography. There have been some people, if you're really into the postal world, there have been a couple of articles in postal journals that talk about him in his role, but they don't talk about him before or after the war. And so after the war, he went back and forth between being essentially a lobbyist, but for the most part, right after the war, he stayed as a special agent of the post office department. And the special agents are now what we call postal inspectors. They have the same duties, but it's a different name, and they're sort of the police force of the post office. But he moved among them immediately after the war. He was in charge of all of the postal use of steamboats, contracting boats and steamboats and ships to deliver the mail, which was huge. I mean, those contracts were extremely lucrative, and the opportunities for graft and corruption were great. So they had to have people who had ironclad integrity in charge of them. So he did that for a while, and then he became in charge of the railroad portion of it in the Midwest. And then, as I said, he became in charge of Kentucky and Tennessee, really for that focused time when Grant needed his help to deal with the Ku Klux Klan. But at one point, as he got on later in life, and I mean, for me, he was still young, but about the time he turned 60, he became deaf. And so he wanted a job in Washington with the post office, and the postmaster at that time would not give him the job. So that's when he quit the post office, and he turned to writing, and he wrote for newspapers. And sometimes he said he was going to write a memoir, but nothing's ever been found. But he wrote these stories about things that happened during the war, tricks that they played on Sherman, tricks that they played on quartermasters. He wrote all of these just amazing stories at City Point that they called the Rialto, where they would give out sort of fake medals and honors and things. And he said Horace Porter was always the clown of the group. But he wrote these stories just and sent them to newspapers, and they were published. But I've not seen them really in any biographies of Grant or Sherman. So I think this is it was really, really interesting. He was, one of Grant's closest friends, went to see him as Grant was dying. then later offered to Julia and Fred to testify in the lawsuit that Adam Badeau was bringing against Grant when he was trying to claim some of the royalties from Grant's memoirs, saying that he had really written them. But in the end, he died at the same age that Grant had died, although 3 years later, at the age of 63 from pneumonia. And I close that with one of the most beautiful letters of condolence I've ever read. And it was the letter that William Sherman sent to Absalom Markland's widow, Martha. And it is just a beautiful letter of condolence. And he is buried at the Oak Hill Cemetery because his wife's family, the Sims, were originally from Washington, D.C., and they really lived out the last part of their lives in Washington, D.C. So you can even go see his grave and that of his wife at the Oak Hill Cemetery in Dumbarton Oaks.
I see we have a question from Carl, but I think, John Anderson, did you have a question?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you for this amazing talk, because I've studied Grant for like 50 years, and you've brought some fresh insights and stories that are really incredible. So I have to thank you for that. And also, I was wondering, Grant organized the vote during the war. I think it was the first to do so, that resulted in Lincoln's re-election. But were the mails used, for that, to undertake that vote?
The mails were used, but not in the way that we vote by mail today. Individual soldiers didn't send their ballot in to be counted. Their votes, they voted in camp. Their votes were tallied, and the certified tallies were sent in by mail from the West. Closer around Washington, they were probably just delivered in person, but yes, in fact, very much so.
During World War II, the U.S. Navy, I know, had its own stationery and envelopes.
So my father was in the Navy, as Kurt mentioned, and I was born on Guam in 1951 during the Korean War, and my dad served on destroyers after that. He was a hospital corpsman. So yes, absolutely. The value of mail was unbelievable. And back then we would do things like we would do reel-to-reel tape recordings, and then my mom would send them. And I didn't put it up here today, but we would draw pictures for our father, and she would package them up and send them through the Fleet Post Office. And when his ship would put into port somewhere, they would gather up all the mail that they had there, and then they would see them. And after my father died, my mom found in his wallet something from each of us 4 kids that she had ended up sending when we were little to him, and he had kept them his whole life in his wallet. Mine was a little picture of an Indian princess, and I have that now, and I just treasure it. But as I say in my book, I remember that, and I remember, just how important all of that was, getting a letter from my father, writing something. But it really wasn't until I read these letters, these Civil War letters, that I really realized that I could see my little letters in my father's homesick eyes. I mean, these letters are just so poignant.
Is there any censorship, any military checking of letters going out for sensitive reasons?
There really was not until later in the war and closer around Richmond and in the Washington area. The letters that were the most highly censored were from POWs, which seems kind of odd because there's not a whole lot, except I guess they had gossip from among their other POWs. Both sides would censor that, but otherwise they were really not censored. And as I said, that's why this is such a unique moment in time. These letters are so unique. Now, the one thing that I will say is that most officers, most commanding generals, and Grant in particular, they would not allow mail from their men to go until a certain period of time after a battle, or a certain period of time before a battle. I mean, they were protective in that way.
Oh, great.
But once that time was up, they could write whatever they wanted.
Great.
Carl Garman, I see you have posted a question on the chat.
Something I've been involved in some original research work with is I've got several Union Army ancestors, but I have not seen any letters that they've wrote. They've just kind of been lost to family and history, except for, of course, some correspondence in the National Archives files, specifically with the Pension Office. I was wondering what kinds of resources you would recommend that I look at, maybe to find letters that may have been digitized or filed in other libraries that might have come from other soldiers that were in the same regiment or in the same place at the same time as the ancestors of my interests. Just what are some resources that you would recommend?
Well, sort of the way that I tried to find out about this unknown man, and I tried going to looking at the different places he had been. And so that included, Kentucky. And so I went to the Kentucky archives and state archives, and then Tennessee. Now, interestingly, I wasn't expecting much from Tennessee because he served as temporary postmaster at Nashville when they took Nashville, and then temporary postmaster at Memphis when they took Memphis. But, I wasn't expecting a lot of letters from there. And it turned out that they had this whole file of letters, but this package of letters had been bought in 1933 at a bookstore in Charleston, South Carolina, by somebody from Tennessee who then gave it to the Tennessee archives. So it's, it's just, you have no idea how you're going to find this stuff. But I think if you know, the unit that he belonged to, where he's from and where that unit is from, I would sort of start there, and especially starting with the local historical societies, and then moving it out, local, county, state, and you might be able to find it that way.
I see, Mick, you have your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Yes, I'm a longtime philatelist, in other words, a stamp collector, and I'd like to know, did the soldiers have to frank their letters with a postage stamp, or was it free? The first postage stamp was issued in Great Britain in 1840 and led to a great expansion of letter writing. Prior to that, the receiver paid for the letter, often refused because of monetary reasons, but the postage stamp just led to an explosion of letter writing. The soldiers, did they have to frank their letters, or was it free?
So this is a great subject, and this was one of the things that I love about doing, researching things. I mean, in the course of writing this book, I learned a lot about the postal system. I learned certainly not as much as about stamps. I had to educate myself about what it was like to be deaf in the 19th century. But the stamp issue is really critical, because that was one of the things that I talk about in terms of the differences between the Eastern theater of the war and the Western theater as far as the U.S. Army. In fact, to take a step back, there is nothing that Congress wants more than to make soldiers happy, because that translates to votes, right? When the war started, particularly in the North, you had to have stamps, but very soon they found out there were a number of reasons why that was not practical. One that I'd never thought of before, but became obvious, was that at the time, this was right about the time, the 19th century was this great ferment of inventions. And they had really just invented a machine that would actually make envelopes that would fold them on their own. But they also invented a machine that would make stamps and make adhesive stamps, which would just turn to like gummy bits of paper junk, however a soldier tried to carry them. If you think about the hazards of war, so that even if soldiers got stamps, a lot of times they couldn't use them. By the time they fished them out of their back pocket and tried to set them out, it didn't work. So in 1862, Congress passed a law that said that if an officer wrote on the stamp, on the envelope, soldier's letter, that then it would be, as it had been before a stamp, it wouldn't go free, but it would go to the family and they would pay for it. And then very shortly after that, they made it free, because then that wasn't quite the right thing. So in fact, that's why you can find, you still find lots of stamps, because a lot of times they could actually get stamps from the little post office in a tent in their camp and put it right on their letter and send it. But you can find these envelopes that have soldiers' letters written on them. And that would be done by a senior officer in camp if you were in the Western Theater until Grant came east. But if you were in the Eastern Theater, that was supposed to be done by the chaplains. And in the Eastern Theater, the chaplains managed the mail and delivered the mail, which became a real problem. And I have some really humorous stories about that. Soldiers seconded to Markland, who handled the mail. And that was one of the really incredible things that Markland talks about when he met Sherman's army when they arrived just outside of Savannah. He said he had this transport with 20 tons of mail, and that was verified by several people. But he said within that group of soldiers were all of these men, all of these soldiers who had served as his postal assistants all the way through, because he had been with the Army of the Tennessee since Fort Henry. And they came in and they took up their job and they dispatched all of that mail just amazingly.
Thank you. Barry from Australia mentions that the soldiers' mail would go to their families with a 3-cent postage due. So the families would have to pay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Barry.
Yeah.
I always learn something from you.
Yeah, no. That was and one of the differences between the Confederate Postal Service and the U.S. Postal Service was that for the same distance, the Confederate Postal Service charged 5 cents.
You mentioned about the ephemeral nature of communications now, but I hope folks who hear this talk when it's archived take action and try to do what they can to preserve the communications, emails, videos, whatever it is that they get from their family members serving, because it is critical. There's not only historical value, but personal value. I mentioned the recordings of a colleague here, and they were audio recordings, and he had recordings of his dad speaking. And I don't have that for my dad, which would have been very meaningful. But also, when I listened to those recordings, you could hear his tenor, and you could hear if he was afraid or strong. You could hear him pouring some ice into a glass and talking about having a little extra drink. You could hear a bomb go off, and he would say, "Just hold on a moment. I got to go see what's going on." And
Oh
the
my
recording would stop. So there's just so much value in those types of correspondence. I hope the kids today, when they're doing their FaceTime, I don't know if you can record those, with your loved ones overseas serving, if they are ways to save it. And they may say, no, I don't want to save that. But maybe some will, because it will preserve history and be meaningful not only to them later and their children and grandchildren later, but also for historical purposes too.
So let me just mention one other aspect of these letters, and it's one that I had really not appreciated either until now. And that is that I try to talk about how what was contained in the letters as the war went on, and how at first in 1861, letters were pretty much about just how everything was so new, and uniforms and, camp and hardtack and all of this stuff. But as the war went on for the U.S. Army members, they began to see slavery. They began to see what caused the war. They began to think about the African Americans and where they fit into this whole equation. But then as the war continued to progress, you had African Americans serving in the U.S. colored troops. And so in their letters, well, they talked a lot about the things that we all think that the white soldiers talked about, the newness of it, being in combat, hardtack, those sorts of things, inequities in pay. But they had a whole other issue that they had to deal with. And I include several letters from U.S. colored troops. One is a letter he's writing on the same day he writes to his children about how much he misses them. And he writes to the woman who owns his children about how much he wants to get his children back. Now, that's a kind of letter you never see in the letter of the white men who are fighting the war. And there's actually a letter that I just love that I printed that was on the same thing. They write to President Lincoln, asking him to let them be relieved of duty for a while so they can go back and try to get their wives or their children from the people who own them. And there's this one great letter that I include, and it's to Abraham Lincoln, and it's from a man named George Washington. There are just some really incredible letters out there that I had never even imagined existed.
Well, I just see now that your book has 352 pages, so that explains it. You've got a lot of letters, and probably a lot that you could not include, or your publisher did not.
Oh, there's so much I couldn't include. I mean, I think actually a good deal of that is are the notes.
So I'm sure there's some sites for other letters that might be available. One of the things in these letters too, you see things like a soldier saying, "Hey, I know it's tough for you. It's tough. You don't have help, but can you go over to see John or Jane and see what they can do?" Or, "Hey, talk to them about getting me a job when I get back." Do you have letters like that too, where there's discussion about after the war and trying to settle up debts or taking care of houses or buying a house? Or
I do talk about letters, and I think I include a couple of excerpts where they talk about, the fact that the women at home are handling all of these finances. I know I talked about it in my first book because Grant really laid a lot of financial issues on Julia, as did Sherman on his wife Ellen. these women were having to juggle these finances and having to stand up to renters who weren't paying rent and things like that.
Candice, thank you so much for what a wonderful talk, inaugural talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.
Good night.